And just as a heads up, y'all, we're gonna try and keep time, like, as Annika invited us into, like, in the space of soft, but we are gonna ask that, that we kind of keep ourselves self-organized around time. Acknowledging that we want to make sure folks got to go to the restroom. So also let's be mindful of those things. Y'all, I am very excited for us to kind of begin with our first panel on permaculture. These wonderful humans have really trekked many different ways to be here with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Devaki, and welcome to our first panel on permaculture.
So, hi everyone, I'm Devaki, and I'm going to follow in Nate's footsteps by reading a poem, and then just a general description of the panelists and how we're going to organize this hour, because we do have to do that to some extent. So, I'll start with the poem first. It's maybe a little more grim than Nate's, but I think something I did want to share with you. It's by a Palestinian poet. It says, "In order for me to write poetry that isn't political, I must listen to the birds. And in order to listen to the birds, the warplanes must be silent." And to me, that's an immense contrast that I want to place to you with the idea of permaculture, which brings the idea of holistic thinking, ecosystems working together. But we've kind of actually destroyed that world very effectively. And I have to say, humans have done a lot of that. So I want to put that as the biggest picture that we can start to think about. And then I want to turn to what Annika has done and how I met Annika. And in the hour, I think, and I'm going to summarize this awfully, is I think she's really challenged us to think about scenarios we don't normally think about in our lives. And by doing that, I think she puts us into a very uncomfortable space where we have to make some of those adjustments in thinking about things. So, she wants us to examine some of the myths that we've grown to accept in a way about our lives, our science, our humanities, and to see if there's new ways to think about interconnected societies. And so before I jump into talking about the panelists, I want to say a little bit about myself. Why the hell am I here? And it is terrifying because most of the spaces I work in are spaces of science. There's a way to deliver things. As Annika said, there's rules that we follow when we go to conferences. And now I'm going to put myself in a position of asking questions, talking to the panelists, and maybe eliciting something that we don't have to get to the end of today. It's a bit of a journey. But at the end of it, maybe we have things to talk about. So that's how I want to place all of this. So I'm a microbiologist and a biochemist by training. I'm interested in microbes, and I think that was one of the big connections I had with Annika when she was at Stanford. And we kind of connected in a way, and we didn't go to the next step, which is really developing projects. So I see this as a way of starting conversations and maybe saying how difficult it is to cross spaces. If you're an artist, you're an artist. If you're a scientist, you're a scientist. And the twain shall never meet. And I think what we're going to try to do today is talk to three extraordinary people who've just exactly that, okay? So let me say one other thing about myself, and that is I've moved from doing biochemistry to thinking about microbes in a space where we know very little about them. We know them in the context of their genomes, but we don't know them as individuals. We don't know how they operate. And I think that's an incredible metaphor for how we are as humans. We seem to know a lot about a few things, and we don't know a lot about many, many other things. And that's the space, hopefully, we can open up. So, without further ado, our three distinguished panelists. I'll start with Arielle because I bet you haven't read every last line of those green folders. So I'll just hit the highlights here. So I'm going to read a bit because I have prepared this. So she'll have a huge list of accomplishments. You have to agree, right? But I'm going to just name a couple. She did her PhD in food chemistry and then moved to Denmark. Not many people do that. and became the house scientist for Noma, which, how many of you have heard of Noma other than the place here? So a handful. So let me tell you, it is one of the most distinguished restaurants in the world, right? People line up for years to try and get a face in. But what Arielle managed to do, I think, was remarkable. She said, you need science in here. And she started the first fermentation labs there, which is really using and combining her ability to think about science critically with bringing it into a space where it is applicable to a larger world. Next thing I want to point out, the last thing, which it may not be in your reference there, is she's going to bring out a big book called Flavorama. It's an irreverent, accessible, essential guide to the science of flavor and how to use it in your own kitchen. So look out for it, March 2024. And the one quote I picked up from what you said on your website extensively, trolling you, is she talks about the strong mutual distrust between scientists and chefs. And she is trying to change that. So that's my introduction to you, Arielle. And I have this in the wrong order, so let's see. Our second panelist is Professor David Wengrow. And he's trained as an archaeologist and currently a professor of comparative archaeology at the University College London. And he's done all the right things, prestigious fellowships all across Europe. And on top of all of that, so that's kind of the straight and narrow, but somewhere along the way, he decided to write a book with David Graeber, and it's very modestly called The Dawn of Everything. So you'll have to live up to that in 10 minutes. And the book has pages and pages of glowing reviews about the book and how it's changed our thinking. And I picked up one of my favorite quotes from Anthony Appiah, who's a philosopher, and he says, he calls it a work of two remarkable scholars, David Wengrow and David Graeber, and that on almost every page is energized by their intelligence, imagination, and surly sense of mischief. I hope we'll see that today.
That was only after I responded to his initial review, which was very critical.
So we have a story there already, right? Yeah. And then Will, who I just met. Actually, I met your kids before I met Will, and I think that was a good choice. They're the most two delightful children. They're, hey. And Zara is the little one. So Will is another amazing panelist. I suspect you're not yet 30. But he's worked all this time to do the most astonishing things. He works on a microbe, which I love and admire. It's called spirulina. It's a blue-green alga, actually, more correctly, a cyanobacterium. And it does all kinds of amazing things. He's collected it, he grows it, he gets protein from it. In addition, of course, as I mentioned, he's a father and a hip-hop artist.
Indeed.
He's the founder and CEO of something called Microsymbiotics, which he founded in 2015. And he calls himself a multidisciplinary citizen scientist who's practicing social scientists, mycology, phycology, molecular biology, and additive manufacturing. That's a handful. But I think for today, what's really important is that he's a true believer in permaculture. And that's a word we haven't bandied around yet. So, since I have a quote for everybody, yours I love. It says, he's always breaking with convention. And as he says, if I can do this, anyone can, and more people should. You will also have to defend that. So that's my introduction to all of them. Hopefully brought out some of the color in what they've done. So in summary, I think when I was thinking about them, because it was incredibly hard to figure out how do I corral these three independent thinkers, independent worlds that they've explored, and I think I'd like to call them irreverent renegades. Agree? But more noticeably, both Will and Arielle are experimentalists, and they bring together expertise from very different spheres of science. David, on the other hand, is an archaeologist and author who looks back in time, as opposed to them who are in the present. And I think hopefully he'll also talk a little bit about how he's breaks with all the boring ideas of the evolution of societies and the origins of inequalities and hierarchies. So very, very big picture. So we have three people and enough of me talking. So I'll just end by saying, well, what is permaculture? And I have to say I am by no means an expert on it, but I'll read what I thought was a very telling definition. It says that permaculture is the concept of utilizing land, resources, people, and the environment in a manner that doesn't produce any waste. That really speaks to me a lot. And encourages the use of closed-loop systems seen in nature. And I think that's a really important point that I haven't stressed enough, that nature is central to how we think about a lot of things, and yet we've divorced ourselves, and it's all a question of conquering it for consumption, capitalism, you name it. So closed-loop systems, when speaking about the environment, refer to an ideal when nothing should be wasted. So it's permaculture, in a way, sort of, I think, emblazons one of the things that Annika has talked a lot about. So in my view, for starters, permaculture can be seen both as a solution and as a pseudoscience, and there's a lot of literature out on that, and everything in between. So that kind of opens it up for discussion. And in this panel, I think what I'm going to try to do is think very broadly about the practice of permaculture, and can it actually really be a solution to some of our contemporary problems, and to use it as a metaphor. So the question I wanted to ask all three of you, and the way I'm going to organize it is we'll ask one set of questions. Maybe each of you take 5 minutes or so, and then another set of questions. And that will bring us up to the time where maybe we can open it up for discussion, since we only have an hour. So my first question to all of you is, in thinking about permaculture, very broadly, can you tell us a story or a theme that speaks to you in the concept of permaculture? And if you're specific about it, that would be great, because it would bring your journey and permaculture together. So maybe about 5 minutes, and I'll...
Oh, should you want me to go first? Okay. Well, I'll probably start in the middle and not at the beginning, like I generally think about things. You know, when you talk about permaculture and closed loops and lack of waste, the stuff I start thinking about that I'm focused on or work in is kind of the idea of resilience, and the resilience of chaotic systems, which in many ways is the complete opposite of what you're encouraged to do as a scientist or as an engineer, which is very, very carefully control all of the conditions and inputs into a system so that you get a very predictable result.
Product.
Yeah, and that can be something that happens in a factory. It can also be in the food world, which is where I am, something like a very predictable fermentation to make yogurt, for example. You're controlling the qualities of the milk that you're starting with, fat percentage, proteins, carbohydrates. You're selecting a very specific strain. You're usually pasteurizing the milk to kill all the other bacteria that are there, and letting this one strain of bacteria do its thing and acidify along a very predictable path, and then you get a very predictable result. Whereas, perhaps since I've never actually studied industrial microbiology, I got into fermentation, working with chefs and restaurants. The approach I learned was much more one of sort of a fuzzy level of control. So in some ways it's impossible to have that level of control over a natural system. Fermentation didn't start as a sterilized, controlled loop. It started as a sort of accidental byproduct of the growth of microbes exploiting some kind of niche. So lactic acid bacteria finding some milk and then sort of doing their thing, creating a waste product, lactic acid, which turned out to be a preservative and delicious. So sort of this accidental chaotic thing became very useful and important for humans. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of my work, a lot of the sort of time I've spent has been sort of figuring out how to de-educate myself from this perspective of like perfect control, predictable outcome. And when we say chaos, that doesn't actually mean like complete randomness. It means dynamic systems that have like unpredictable, well, semi-predictable, semi-unpredictable results. So a more we can talk about permaculture as farming, but also culturing bacteria, cultured foods, where you can kind of empirically figure out like the few things that are useful to have some level of control over, like you can coax the temperature in a certain direction, or add a little bit of like old fermentation to new one, and then get something that is not perfectly predictable, but usually pretty tasty and often like spectacular, which like doesn't really happen if you have this much like more fragile constructed system.
So that's a great introduction, I think, to the ideas you've brought about, which is that you don't have to have complete control over everything, and sometimes you get unexpected results.
I mean, I think complete control over anything is an illusion.
Not possible.
Yeah.
All right. David, so shall I remind you, permaculture, history, and relating it to what you've discovered.
Yeah, I don't think I was saying to Annika yesterday, I don't think I've ever used the word permaculture ever. Like in any context ever. And
Well, let's shake hands on that. Nor have I.
It's not a bad thing. It just conjures up images in my head of like the 1970s and the slow movement and like people trying to repackage indigenous knowledge for urban design. Those are all good things, but it's not a term I've ever used. But I thought I could maybe just pick up on one point, which is in the text of the booklet that you have, which is about this question of whether agriculture and cultivation are necessarily, by their very nature, a kind of burden on the soil, and are necessarily extractive over the long term, is something I've been quite interested in. Actually, I just came back very recently from Brazil, where there's incredible work going on in Amazonia, in my field, archaeology and anthropology, where they're discovering that these tropical soils, which were always kind of stereotyped as being rather ephemeral and unable to support large populations, none of it's true. It turns out now that there are actually these really dense urban scale settlements and infrastructures in Amazonia before European contact, going back centuries and even millennia. How is this possible? Well, it seems to be a lot to do with these special soils which have become quite famous. There they call them terra preta des indios, the dark soils of the Amazon, which turn out to be anthropogenic soils. They're humanly created soils, which are actually the product of waste products from settlements going back into the earth and enriching it over generations, and actually vastly increase the carrying capacity of these soils. And this has become kind of a thing associated with Amazonia, but actually one of the things I've been working on for the last year in collaboration with a guy called Eyal Weizmann, who is, he invented this thing called forensic architecture. And we worked on a project together which is about other candidates for these kind of anthropogenic soils, which actually come from Ukraine. Before the Russian invasion, there were a lot of projects going on north of the Black Sea, between the Bug and the Dnieper rivers. And a team, it's sort of a mixed Ukrainian and German team of scientists, have actually made the case that the famous Dark Earths, if any of you read that guy, what's his name, who wrote Black Earth? Tim, you know the guy. Tim something, that guy.
We'll come back to it.
Bloodlands, he wrote Bloodlands. What's his name? He's super famous.
Somebody will look it up.
Sorry? Snyder, Timothy Snyder, yeah. So it's those earths, those incredibly, they call them chornozem, black soils. They're like some of the most fertile soils in the world, which for millennia, they attracted colonizers all the way from the ancient Greeks to Putin, via Stalin and Hitler and all the rest. But it turns out that there is actually a case that those hyper-fertile soils, which actually produced the grain that fed the democracy of 5th century Athens via its colonies on the Black Sea, might also have a very strong humanly made anthropogenic component,
element.
which goes back to these huge settlements, just 6,000-year-olds. Some of the world's first urban settlements are buried under a meter of that black soil. And before the settlements, there is no black soil. So there is something, and these are arguably some of the world's first cities, the first cities in Europe. And they're very interesting also because they seem to be completely decentralized. There are no palaces or temples, very few signs of social inequality. And they seem to have practiced a form of mixed agriculture, herding, fishing, foraging, that potentially actually enriched the land that they inhabit. So it's kind of mind-blowing if it's true or even half true, like a form of urban life that actually enhances the vitality of the soil it inhabits. So I've been interested in that kind of thing, which may or may not have anything to do with permaculture, but it's as close as I can get.
Well, in a very broad way you are. And I think opening up ideas that people in this room may not be familiar with, the idea that, this is how evolution happened, and you kind of tear that apart a little bit, right? To say that there were agricultures, right? And there were societies that were doing very well without hierarchies, right? If I were to summarize. All right, so we have Will then, who actually is a proponent of permaculture and doing it. So really as a practitioner, what would you really
designer,
tell us?
permaculture designer. There's like an international certification that you can get, permaculture design certification. I love that you brought up the research down in the Amazon. I remember listening to the dissemination of the LiDAR research whenever they were looking out of helicopters to find those highways and everything.
Did you see the latest one? It's insane.
Oh.
They've identified like 10,000 new sites. Or
That's for later. But it just rewrites human history. And like I love this quote that's like, would the most advanced human civilizations even be recognizable, or would they have been so succinct with nature that it'd be hard to find them? I mean, we're literally using like sensitive laser technologies to find these things under immense soils. And the story that I wanted to bring up is like my introduction into permaculture, really. So like I had a unique upbringing. My grandfather was the first African-American English professor in New York City at Medgar Evers, and he provided me with a lot of purpose in my young life and like a reason to live on through the legacy of what he had to deal with growing up in Jim Crow era and like not being able to go to school, and how he created a life for my family from that. And my mom became a diplomat. I moved to London when I was in 4th grade. And there I felt like at that point in my life I saw, the proto version of what I was living in the United States. Like the ideas, the ideological formation of like the architecture and the social structures and things like that. And then I lived in Mexico City for a little bit, where I saw poverty like I never saw as I traveled around through Mexico and realized that inequality was very real in the world. I grew up Catholic and actually went on a mission in Mexico when I was 13, and that's really when I decided that I wanted to explore other avenues of thinking. Then I went to Taiwan and I saw hyper-surveillance, futuristic technology state and that's when I dropped out of high school. So I was 17 years old, and I realized at that point that the things that I wanted to learn weren't available for me to learn, and I was also very appalled with the state of humanity. and I rather would have died than participate in the march of progress in the way that I had saw it. So I just was thirsty for something different, and I spent a lot of time exploring different religions, exploring meditations, binaural beats, like mantras, mudras, psychedelics, all different kinds of things to, discover to find something that I was looking for. And I found it deep in meditation, working with Hebrew, Aramaic, Egyptian, Tibetan, Sanskrit languages in my meditations. I found a lot of information there. And I feel like those were, some of the last code languages that humans really interacted with our biological computer, for lack of better words, to figure out what kind of vibrations trigger certain sensory experiences and things like this. So I'm coming out of these deep meditations, and nobody knows, nobody's relating to me at all. I'm like 17, 18 years old, head shaved, meditating all the time, talking about aliens and pyramids and things like this. And everybody's like, what the heck is wrong with this kid? I lost all my friends. And then my lady got pregnant with our son. He's 9. I'm only 29. So you asked if I'm 30 next year. So I was 20 years old, and everybody's just like, what is going on with this kid? My parents are trying to get me to go to the military. They're trying to clean up my act or whatever. My dad's in the second generation in the army. My mom works for the government. So they didn't understand what I was doing at all. And my lady's mom had some hippie friends, and she said, they're doing this permaculture stuff over in the next town over. I think Will might be interested. So I go over there, and the first time in my life I saw something that was produced of human ideology that was didn't feel aggressive when I looked at it. It felt much more harmonious. And this was a time when I was just learning about going to nature. I grew up in cities. I didn't go camping, I didn't go fishing, I didn't do none of that. So I was 18, so I wanted to go smoke weed. I was in Pennsylvania, I had to go in the woods, so I don't get in trouble. You know what I mean? So I was out in the woods, I'm getting high, I'm like, yo, what? Sticks turns into dirt. That's my first visual hallucination I ever had. I'm like, sticks and leaves turns into dirt. And then I'm tripping, I'm like, how am I 17 years old and I never saw this for my whole life? And the trees was always just a blurry thing out the highway when I'm going really fast. So then I slowed down, and time and space it's all relative. So I slowed down, and the trees had a whole different life from whenever I was going fast and living in the cities. And I started to realize, as an indigenous Taino and as a product of the transatlantic slave trade, I was brought here because I know how to interact with the symbolism of nature. So I was like, this is who I am, and I can see this, and it makes sense to me. And I, through that, developed my ecological research business. But permaculture is what gave me the ability to do that. As a high school dropout in central Pennsylvania, looking as I look, minimum wage is $7.25. We have a son, I'm 20 years old. We're struggling to figure it out. I utilize permaculture and what I learned in that backyard through my mentors, Benjamin Weiss, Rafika Muhammad, and Wilson Alvarez. I took that, I went home, and I got a little 2x4 mushroom grow tent. I started growing mushrooms. I was serving tables, and I was able to take the money that I made from growing mushrooms and eating those mushrooms and turn it into the business that I'm operating now almost 10 years later.
I don't know, we should have a hand for all three of you for the first round. I think that was pretty amazing. So we have to keep an eye on the time, unfortunately, so that you guys get to ask questions. What I'm going to tell you now is use your Twitter brain to make the shortest questions you can squeeze in so that we can all get a chance, although there will be lunch, etc. So the next round I'm going to try and keep short, just so that we get a chance for questions. And I want you, because Annika has brought up things from, the whole evolution of human history, the evolution of biology, and we want to take a little piece of that. And what I want you to do is, in that context, is there an insane idea or a sane idea that you would like to put out to this audience, something you really would like to do in the next 3 years? You can be as provocative as you like, and I know I haven't asked any of you, so it's coming at you right now. But I think maybe, again, to go into a space where we don't normally think about these things, we certainly never talk about it to a whole audience. Is there something that keeps you up at night and says, I want to really think about this, I don't have the audience, I don't have the wherewithal?
Yeah.
And short this time so that.
Okay. Yes, there is a thing that keeps me up at night. Well, there's many things that keep me up at night, but one of them is the. Okay, so I'm background in food chemistry, but my subject, my raison d'être, is flavor. Flavor is taste and smell, and taste and smell come from molecules, so they're chemical senses. So historically, both taste and smell, but especially smell, at least in the West, has been sort of sidelined as like a not very important and sort of base and animalistic sense that we should just like not pay attention to. When in fact, smell receptors make up about 2% of our genome. They're the largest group of genes that we have as humans, and the chemical senses were probably evolutionarily we developed them before like vision, hearing. So the thing that keeps me up at night is this sense of like it's way more important than we've been giving it credit for.
Yeah.
So that there's sort of like tantalizing hints of like, okay, so if we don't look at flavor as either a luxury experience or like something added to snack foods, like what else is it? And there's sort of tantalizing hints, like for example, in tomatoes, there's a flavor molecule that we're like extremely sensitive to, and called beta-damascenone, and that is created in the tomato as the breakdown product of vitamin A. And there's a similar non-vitamin A molecule that breaks down into a similar aroma molecule that we're not very sensitive to. So if we're 10,000 times more sensitive to a chemical signal about vitamin A, like why are we not focusing a lot about flavor, evolution, health, diet? So that's
a fantastic idea, and actually totally unexplored, either scientifically or from a human lens, any lens.
There's like a handful of papers, but people aren't really focusing on it.
Insane ideas. I know you haven't slept much since you crossed from the UK here, so you probably have some insane ideas.
3 years. Yeah, I mean, just like a selfish kind of personal thing I want to do. Actually, it has a Metaspore theme, because I take things very literally. So if Metaspore is not just a metaphor, what is it? So actually, my little pet thing that I would love to do is go to a part of northern Australia called the Kimberley, where they have these rock paintings, which are kind of an enigma, because the oldest ones may be tens of thousands of years old, but they're incredibly vivid. And it turns out that this is all to do with art and spores, as in fungi, like rock fungi. So it turns out these paintings are actually alive. Basically what happens is the pigment that they used degrades and deteriorates. It's like etched into the sandstone, into the rock. It breaks down silicas in the rock, and it becomes inhabited by these cyanobacteria that actually start producing what looks like paint, but exactly replicate the outline of the original. So these things are alive, and there are Aboriginal traditions in that area about going and constantly retouching the paintings. But with these ones, they don't need to, because they do
They're
it.
self-sustaining.
They generate themselves over thousands of years. So I want to go and see that Metaspore art.
And if you do go, bring me back some samples of cyanobacteria.
I don't think that's allowed, but okay.
You've never done things that are allowed. Come on. Okay, Will. Can you top that?
I mean, it's an incredible honor just to be sitting here. Really, like as a truffle nerd, I'm super excited for your work because it just like blows my mind and my whole limbic system. And like, if you ever find yourself in Pennsylvania, let's go look at the petroglyphs in the Susquehanna River. It's like one of the oldest rivers in the whole world, and there's like Toltec symbols mixed with the Native American symbols up there.
Let's do it.
Yes.
Hey,
so-
what about us?
Yeah, please join. I could take you guys. We'll go on a whole foraging escapade and look at the whole
Hell yeah.
multi-dimensional
Okay,
experience.
so you guys
So-
just sign up with Will.
Yeah, that's the next 3 years, right? So, but yeah, as far as like the next 3 years, I'm working on developing mycosymbiotics into a cooperative because I've developed and attained a fair amount of assets focused on ecological research in my career, and I've connected with a lot of very powerful individuals around the world. Some of them in this room that are focused on researching unique aspects of our natural world, and some of them are very fragile. Like while we still have them. One of my best friends, Anthony Rodriguez. He's a filmmaker from New York, Anthony Basil Rodriguez, and he's been traveling around with his own money, saving up throughout his 20s, traveling around the world looking at rare plants. Specifically, he's interested in bananas, and he's been going to places that are at risk of deforestation from palm oil plantations. And he goes and he's finding bananas that has never even been photographed before. And he knows about botany, but if I'm with him, I know about tissue culture and molecular biology, and I have a molecular biology lab I can put into a briefcase, so I can do DNA sequencing anywhere in the world on site, which is important, and I can do it like in real time. So if there's like a construction equipment right there, I can get the sample and get the sequence, which if we lose that specimen forever, we have the DNA, which there's de-extinction technologies that are developing, and some people say, oh, we don't go there, but like there's a point in time where all the technologies we use right now is, oh, we don't go there, and like it evolves into
And
something.
then we do.
Yeah, so like I know that eventually, maybe in my child's lifetime, the information that we have, even from a genetic code, may be usable to revitalize environments and to provide more natural wealth again. So I want to create a cooperative around the assets that I've collected so that we can send off the individuals that are part of our community as mycosymbiotics to go do this field research, which we've specialized, trained ourselves in doing around the world, so that we can go study the fungi, the plants,
And the interactions.
and the
right?
interactions, the animals, and look at them. Because one of my favorite quotes in the world, and I say it in almost every one of my talks, it comes from Terence McKenna. He says, DNA is protein syntax uttering itself into existence. And I was trained literate. I was trained by an English professor, and he taught me how to interact with language. He taught me how to interact with syntax. So when I go in nature and I look at nature as literate, as a language speaking to me, it starts to tell me the stories of how it even ended up looking the way it looks. And it helps us because 99% of it is not here. So if you can look at the oak tree and tell about the story of how it looks like an oak from everything that happened to it that's not here anymore, then you can learn a lot in a bigger picture. So I want to be able to develop this cooperative so that we can focus on this research, because that research doesn't pay right away. But if we can put that grant money behind it and get ourselves organized, we can provide the most wealth, because all economic systems are based on the soil. All economic systems, all wealth, all value is based on healthy ecosystems.
All right. So that's, to me, really an exciting conversation. I would love to have this continue, but it isn't fair to have you sitting here and not being able to ask questions. So we actually have maybe about 10 minutes or so to ask questions, and I will be the czar here and decide who gets to ask questions. So raise your hands, and maybe if you want to ask it to somebody specific or more generally, and I'll ask the panelists to keep your answers short so that we can have as many thoughts come out here. Everybody's just zapped with permaculture. Any questions?